Hi, I'm Doug Jackson. I'm one of the fifth year thesis professors this year, and I'm also the coordinator of the fifth year thesis year. And I thought I would make this video to answer some questions that I'm assuming you all have about fifth year and to talk a little bit about my studio as well. I think we can all remember, the fifth year professors and I, how sort of momentous but also mysterious fifth year felt when we were undergrads. I know in my case, I entered into my fifth year undergraduate thesis and nobody had explained to me what it was like or what the hell a thesis was or what the hell I was supposed to be doing, and it was really bewildering. And so I want to try to, if I can, put you guys at ease a little bit about what it's like. So what I've got is I've got a series of questions here, and I'm going to go through and answer them to the best of my ability. Also, you're welcome to give me an email or a phone call over summer if you have any additional questions or you want to talk to me specifically about concerns or questions that you might have about my studio. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so the first question that I'm assuming everybody has is, how is fifth year different from all of the other years at Cal Poly? And it is true that it is different. One of the things that I think that is important to remember is that every year at Cal Poly, or every year in any undergraduate institution, is not really about mimicking the real life of working in the profession. Each year is sort of artificially focused on learning a particular thing. So for example, in third year is like way more artificially focused on structure and systems than you would ever really obsess about in a real project. First year is way more focused on sort of foundational thinking about projects, way more than you would ever focus on in a real project. So school is a kind of an artificial thing to begin with. It's sort of helping you guys practice or learn to design by practicing on specific things, kind of like learning scales if you're playing an instrument. And fifth year is no different than that. It's just focused on different types of things. So in fifth year, what we're trying to do is to create an environment in which you're focused very specifically on larger questions about architecture, a kind of disciplinary asking, what is architecture now? How is it participating in the world? What are other opportunities for it to participate in the world in other ways? And how is it producing some kind of value in the world? And these are questions that you might not be able to ask in every single project that you work on outside of school when you're in the profession, but there are kinds of questions that the discipline and profession of architecture needs to sort of continually address in order to make sure that it's doing work that is sort of meaningful to society. And so every so often the discipline will have a kind of a reassessment, of what it does, and somebody will say, I think we need to be working in another way, or we need to spend a lot more focus on sustainability, or a lot more focus on this or that. And fifth year is a chance for you all to kind of practice engaging in these questions and to become even more familiar than you already are with the kind of ongoing conversation of architecture that's happened up to this point. So the reason you do a kind of independent design thesis is for you to use that thesis as a way to take a kind of a position on architecture and to learn to become a kind of strong advocate for that position and to design architecture in a way that defends that position. And again, this isn't to say that this is the way that you would design architecture outside of school, but it is what we believe an important thing for you to learn and to practice doing to become good, responsible architects and stewards of the architectural discipline. And so the other thing to remember is that I think a lot of people think that the thesis is really just one big finale where you take everything that you learned in school and you embody it in one kick-ass building design, and then you're done. And so I'm not sure that's the best way to think about it. I think that when people think about doing a thesis project that way, it's really sort of like retroactively accumulating and presenting everything that they learned, rather than treating it like a learning opportunity. And I think that all of the fifth year faculty and I firmly believe that fifth year is just as much of a learning and growth opportunity as any of the other years at Cal Poly. And so I would encourage you all to think about your thesis project as a chance to try new things, and to actually grow. And so many of you might not really think that you have a position on architecture, for example, and I think that's perfectly normal. I know that when I was a fifth-year undergraduate, I probably felt the same way. But it's a chance for you to figure one out and try one on and learn what it feels like to take a stance and say, I think this about architecture, and I think you should also think this about architecture, and here's what would happen if we designed architecture this way, and to use the sort of thesis project as a way to kind of demonstrate that position. Okay, so the second question that I'm sure is on everybody's minds is, what the hell is a thesis, right? I know that, like I mentioned in the last question, I didn't really know that, and I did one anyway as an undergraduate. Nobody actually sat down and told me this is what a thesis is. In fact, I remember a particular instance when I was working at my desk and some graduate level professor walked by and said, what are you doing? And I explained what I was doing, and he says, that's really interesting, but that's not a thesis. And then he turned around and walked away. And briefly, what a thesis is that the term thesis, it's related to the term hypothesis, and it comes basically from a PhD doctoral dissertation. And in a PhD doctoral dissertation, which has always been the final degree of any educational process, what was required of the student leaving the university and entering into whatever discipline they were studying was not to simply prove that they learned all the stuff that they were supposed to learn at the university. That was the university's job to ensure that. Instead, what a PhD dissertation proved is that the student was no longer a student, but actually had something to offer to the discipline that they were entering into. So if they were studying chemistry, that they had an idea about chemistry and were able to kind of pursue that idea and test it and either confirm or deny that hypothesis and actually provide new knowledge to the discipline of chemistry. And the way it was evaluated is that a bunch of eminent chemists, for example, would come and sit and hear the student present their work and decide, yeah, that's pretty good, or that's really valuable, or I really think this person can be one of us. Now, obviously, you're not doing a PhD dissertation, but that's basically what a PhD dissertation is now. A thesis at the graduate or undergraduate level is a sort of modified version of that, where it's sort of simplified down. And the reason it's administered is because either the graduate institution or the undergraduate institution thinks that there's some kind of core value that comes out of that process, even if it gets simplified down a little bit, that would be worthwhile as a sort of culminating project for that institution. Not every undergraduate architectural institution requires a thesis. Some of them just require a kind of final project. Sometimes that project is a sort of comprehensive or real-world building project. The reason we require a thesis is that we think that there's something valuable about the idea of practicing what it feels like to contribute new knowledge to the discipline. Now, I know you've only had 4 years of experience learning about architecture, and so that might seem really premature. But like I mentioned in the previous question, we do think that there's some value in trying to take a stand on a particular position about architecture. It's a really good way to learn about contemporary debates in architecture and why those debates are important to allow the discipline to grow in response to new social, cultural, or technological phenomena, and so on. And we want you all to have that experience as a kind of final experience before you leave. So in our case, the thesis is a design thesis, rather than a sort of a thesis where you would actually do a test, like a chemical experiment, and write up a report about your findings. In a design thesis, the design becomes the kind of proof of the hypothesis. So you'll make a conjecture about architecture, or you'll make a statement about how you think architecture should be, or so on. And do a design that kind of gives life to that position and becomes a sort of proof of the value of that position. So again, the way to think about the design project is not as just one big project, but it's actually a kind of a statement or a kind of an embodiment of an idea. So another question that I think might be on everybody's minds is if a thesis is a kind of independent research and design project, then why are we doing them in thesis studios? And I think that's a very sensible question. But like I mentioned in the previous questions, we really believe that the thesis isn't just a sort of maverick endeavor where you go off and do your own thing, but it's actually a learning process. And so just like any of the other years at Cal Poly, it really benefits from the mentorship of a kind of studio professor to help give you guys constructive criticism as you're working on your project, but also as I'm sure you're familiar from your previous studios, everybody gets a lot of value from the kind of discussions you have with your peers. I know that when I was an undergraduate student, I actually felt like I got a lot better criticism from my peers than I did from my studio professors. I hope my students don't feel that way, but I remember very distinctly having that impression, and so I think we think it's super valuable, no matter what you're doing in school, for you to do it in a context where you have peers who are kind of in the know about what you're doing, and you're in the know about what they're doing, and you guys can exchange information and exchange critique, and that's no less different than in your 5th year doing your thesis project than it is in any other year. In fact, because you all are doing individually different things, it might be an even more valuable support network for you to do that as well. And I think it's also, most importantly, perhaps, it mimics the kind of extreme heterogeneity that exists, ideological heterogeneity that exists within the architectural discipline. So you'll have a room, let's say, of 20 people in a thesis studio. Everybody's working on their own thing. There's a lot of difference of opinion in there. And that's a really good context to sort of vet your ideas and have everybody else vet their ideas with you, right? You have to kind of defend what you're working on, and so you might have a classmate who says, my thesis is sort of taking the opposite position, and so you'll have to have that kind of conversation with them. At the same time, the studio is inherently a kind of support network, so everybody would have your back. So nobody would really take you to the mat, so to speak, about your idea, but it would be a kind of friendly back and forth. So all of those things, I think, make the studio a much more fertile environment for developing a thesis. When I was an undergraduate, we didn't do it that way. I was just told I could have a desk anywhere in the building, and I went and I sat somewhere, and I think there was a 2nd-year studio near me, and I never really talked to any other thesis student. At the beginning of the year, that sounded great, right? But it actually wasn't really great. And so I always wished, if I could change anything about my undergraduate thesis, would be that I would be doing it in a group of other people that were doing the thesis at the same time. And I think it's really great that that's how we do it here at Cal Poly. So another question you all might have is, does my thesis studio have a particular focus? And it is true that some thesis studios do have a kind of a unique focus. So there will be, I'm fairly certain, a thesis studio that is singularly focused on environmental issues. There are sometimes thesis studios that are sort of singularly focused on urban issues. In my case, I've never really had a topical focus for my studio. I do have my own particular research interest, but I'm not really interested in running a studio that's focused on a particular topic, and that's one of the reasons I like teaching 5th years. So I don't really have a topical focus for my studio. So if you're in my studio, you can work on anything you want topically, and also just in terms of there's a different range of scope of projects that you can work on. You can have different attitudes about architecture even. You could have a thesis project that is inherently utopian, you could have one that's dystopian, you could have one that's fictional or science fictional or super realistic and technologically innovative or super fantastical. I don't really care. In fact, I think that the difference in the studio is a huge asset. So I like it when people are working on radically different things and we're all talking about all of those things all at once and sharing information about everybody's thesis project. I would say that if there is a particular emphasis, it's really on pushing boundaries. I want to create an environment, at least for this year of your education, where you're really questioning basically how can architecture be? Why is it the way it is? How could it be different? Why would it be better if it were different in a particular way? And not having a kind of collective agreement about that, because I don't think that is the way architecture operates. In a contemporary sense, architecture is just an open question, right? At any moment in time, somebody can fundamentally challenge the basis or the value of architecture, and I think it's important to sort of revel in the openness of that question. And I like having a studio in which that question is constantly kept open and never settles into a particular kind of ideology or dogma or whatever. So pushing boundaries is the major thing, or keeping things open and questioning, or seeing how far you can push architecture. Another thing that I think is worth talking about is I think sometimes, or I have the suspicion that sometimes students entering into the fifth year have very simple assessments of what the different thesis studios are about, and that sometimes a kind of oversimplification of my studio is that it's some kind of theory studio. And I don't think that's a really fair assessment, or a very accurate assessment, although in some ways every thesis studio should really be a kind of a theoretical investigation, because it's asking basic fundamental questions about architecture and its value, and that's one of the things that we want you to do in the fifth year. But also, like, when people say theory studio, they make it sound like theory is some kind of abstract, sometimes useless or esoteric sort of investigation. And I think that one of the reasons I really want to dispel that is that I remember as an undergraduate, theory seemed really exotic and kind of strange, and I was really intrigued by it, but also a little bit frightened by it. And I think that's sort of a natural condition for a lot of undergraduate students. And one of the things that I hope we do in the fifth year is really demystify theory. I think basically theory is not that, it doesn't have to be that esoteric. I think there's a lot of reasons why architectural theory seems esoteric, or is sometimes framed as being loftier than it is. But really, theory is just a basic description of why we do something and why we think it's valuable. I mean, you could have a theory about pasta shapes, right? You know, why are penne or whatever better for holding sauce? Theory can be applied to any kind of thing. And so I don't really think that my studio is any more theoretical than any others. However, I am interested in a studio in which we ask very basic questions about architecture and try out different things. The last thing I think I would say about my studio is that it's really based on you all having lots of different ideas about architecture and really pushing them. And so one of the things that I think is characteristic about my studio is that I work really hard to help you develop confidence about your ideas and to become the kind of strongest advocate for your ideas possible. I remember, when I was an undergraduate student, I had ideas definitely about architecture, but I wasn't very confident in them. I'd never really had to stand up and present them. We didn't have a school where there was a lot of formal presentations. And I just had these ideas and I was able to talk about them with my friends, but if anybody ever challenged me on them, I probably would have just withered. And I think that one of the things that we hope you get out of fifth year is an ability to be confident about your ideas, and also to kind of assert that confidence both in your design work and in the way you stand up and present your work. And those are things that I really wished somebody had helped coach me on, and that's something I really spent a lot of time working on with all of my students. So another question I'm sure you have is how is my studio structured? And my desire really is to have the least amount of structure necessary, but because it is a studio, there's some degree of structure just to kind of take advantage of the studio format and help make sure that although everybody is working on their own independent project, that there's enough sort of parity in the timelines of those projects that people can help each other out, so that people are roughly at the same point in their project at roughly the same time. But as you know, it's a year-long project, and the way that gets broken up is at the beginning of the year, there's a fair amount of time spent just helping you all identify a kind of thesis position. I think some of you will come into fifth year with an idea about what you want to work on, but it isn't really quite honed into a sort of a thesis statement or project. Some of you won't come in with even that. You'll just have general interests about architecture. You won't be sure, and all of those things are fine. You know, we're accustomed to that. That's just the way things work at Cal Poly, and it's not a big deal. Even if you walk into the door in fifth year and say, I don't know what I want to work on, we have time to help you figure that out. And if you come in with an idea about what you want to work on and then you change your idea, that's also fine, or at least it's fine with me. There's a kind of what you might call a sort of thesis prep that's built into the beginning of my studio. In some schools, that thesis prep would happen before you do your thesis, like say in your fourth year. But because fourth year Cal Poly is so, there's such a diaspora of people who are going off and doing different things, we don't really have a thesis prep in the fourth year. So I have a thesis prep built into fall quarter. And it lasts a certain amount of time, and it's a period in which you more or less figure out what you want to be working on, or your area of research that your thesis would be involved in, and then you conduct some research and become an expert on that area of interests, and it could be anything. One of the ways that you pursue that research is not only by reading prior texts that deal with this issue, which could be architectural text or could be text from elsewhere, watching films, doing some writing, but also you'd be doing some design work, right? We, as you know, or as I'm sure you believe, designing is a way to help generate ideas and help hone and focus ideas as much as anything else. And so fall quarter in my studio, there's a fair amount of design studying happening at the same time as you're reading and writing. And so all this stuff is kind of contributing to the building up of a degree of expertise about a particular topic and a particular mode of working. And then it gets refined throughout the rest of fall quarter. Sometime in late fall quarter, you will have reached a point where you definitely know what you're doing in terms of a kind of intellectual position, and you can begin to identify a project that would sort of exemplify or bear out that position. So in my studio, you don't really necessarily come in with a project saying, you know, I want to design this kind of a building, although you can have that idea. But like I've said in some of the previous answers to these questions, the thesis project should really be an instrument in which you prove a kind of idea about architecture. And so in my studio, the identification of the project doesn't really happen until you have kind of solidified a sort of conceptual position about architecture and a series of design strategies about that. So sometime in late fall quarter, you will basically get to the point where you can say, actually no, the project that I'm working on, and you can start designing that project, and it will be fueled by all of the investigation and research that you've done up to that point. And that continues on through winter quarter. And then I try to reserve spring quarter for basically production. So in an ideal scenario, you would have your design completely figured out by the end of winter quarter, and you could use the entire spring quarter to figure out how you're going to present it, and even do a much better presentation of a project than you've ever done at Cal Poly. Either make a gazillion renderings, or do an animation, build a couple of really stellar models, do a graphic novel if you want to do that. So I try to reserve time to allow people to do those kinds of things so you don't have a very normative presentation at the end of a year-long thesis project. We'll also put on an exhibition. You can read a little bit more about that in my perspectives, and you can see some examples of some previous exhibitions that we've done. But I think, like I said, because a thesis is learning to take a position on architecture, learning how to kind of present and get up and disseminate that information to people and allow them to evaluate your work is also a really crucial part of that process. And so we take the display of the work in our studio really, it's a thing. It's like kind of a project. And then the last thing I'll say is that the studio is really run like a kind of a think tank and a workshop. So there's always stuff happening. There's no hierarchy. I'm there to help as a kind of a resource. Ideas are being bounced back and forth. Stuff is being tested and built and taken apart and figured out. So it's a mess, but it's a glorious mess. Another common question that people have is, will there be a field trip? And the answer is yes. I think it in a really great way, it's been customary for fifth-year studios to take a group field trip somewhere, and we take one every year. I can't tell you where we're going to be going because we always figure that out as a studio. So it can be a domestic trip, it can be an international trip. What we'll do is we'll sit down at the very beginning of the year and sort of figure out where we might like to go and when we might like to do it. In past years, we've almost exclusively taken the field trip during spring break, although we can also take it in winter quarter if you all want. The reason that we've done the spring break trip is that in almost every instance I've tried to set up a kind of off-campus review at the location that we take our trip, and I think that works better if that happens later in the year because the thesis projects are way more developed and the feedback, it's easier to get better feedback at that point. But if we don't want to do that, then we can also take the trip earlier. And in addition to that one big field trip, we'll also probably take a bunch of other smaller field trips. And so the last question is, what is my teaching philosophy? I think the easiest way to kind of answer that is to say basically that I really care about architecture and I really care about its future. And like I've mentioned in answers to previous questions, I think that architecture is fundamentally an open question. It's a discipline that is unique in its constant dialogue with the culture that it operates within. No other discipline really operates as a kind of conversation with culture and society. The medical discipline grows, but it grows through research and experiment, and culture and society don't tell the medical discipline what's important or what they really want from the medical discipline. Architecture, on the other hand, really does exist because it has to create spaces and buildings that are meaningful and relevant and significant to culture. It constantly has to kind of respond to new social, cultural, and technological changes. So we have no idea about the future of architecture. We can't predict the future of society. We can't really predict the future of culture. We can't really predict the future of technology. And we certainly can't predict the future of architecture. But it's important to be facile and open to changes and to be opportunistic about new ways for architecture to kind of engage the social, cultural, and technological realities. And the only way to kind of help students prepare for that is to help them embrace the kind of openness of architecture, be facile with different ideas about architecture, and to be people who embrace change and innovation. In my case, I really enjoy new challenges all the time. When I practiced architecture full-time, I tried to run my practice in a way where I was always doing new things, always trying different types of projects, always trying to do things in a different way. And I really enjoy getting to help students kind of develop, a huge spectrum of ideas and help them bring those ideas to fruition. And then I think the last sort of important characteristic about the way that I teach is that I don't really enjoy hierarchy, and I don't really enjoy formality. So I like a studio environment where everybody's on the same footing, and where I guess I would say the sort of ideal image in my mind of a studio is all of us sitting around shooting the shit about architecture, coming up with crazy ideas, figuring out how to do those crazy ideas, and basically having fun with architecture.